Hold on to your butts.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello.
Welcome to episode 171 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Tonight, as always, I am joined by the most awesome Civil War nerd I know, Darren. I am just his co-host named Mary.
Yeah, I didn't want to even talk about your intros anymore.
No.
It's like a slow train wreck. But anyway, it's okay. It's okay. We are back, Mary. We are back. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
It's great. It's a holiday here, Mary. It's Juneteenth. It's Friday afternoon. We're recording this. We are both free of our employment obligations. So we can go ahead and record an episode a little bit early tonight for future shenanigans later on this evening.
Yes, but before we get to that, I have to ask you, what are you drinking and out of
Thank
what
you,
mug?
Mary. Thank you, Mary. I'm drinking, it's just Yingling because that's what we have, and out of my Vote for Lincoln mug because he's part of this episode a little bit, sort of. What about yourself?
I'm drinking Yingling as well, and I'm drinking it out of my General Sherman staff mug. Howard's on it.
Well, of course.
So,
Because why wouldn't he be?
he should be everywhere.
Oh, absolutely he is. Anyway, Mary, today we're going to talk about one of the most covert organizations in American history. It's a system of travel to the North that was mostly mouth to ear that created a secret religious and Masonic network used to guide freeing slaves escaping to the North into freedom. This, of course, is the Underground Railroad. And despite operating in the shadows and under the noses of federal law, and prowling, slave catchers, the Underground Railroad is said to have helped over 100,000 former slaves escape to freedom from the 1790s or so up until the end of the Civil War.
And where slavery existed, so did efforts to escape this horrible institution. It would go across state and international borders, particularly into Canada, as well as into Mexico, into Spanish Florida. And this Spanish Florida was the late 17th century to around 1790. Indian Territory, the West Caribbean Islands, and Europe. But Canada was definitely one of the more prominent destinations. And we're going to talk about a little bit about Canada's role in the Underground Railway in a little while in this episode.
Yeah. But the Underground Railroad, it was a culmination of a resistance movement that started almost immediately when African slaves began to arrive in North America. Now, it was August of 1619, and an English privateer named John Colin Jope, he was armed with a Dutch letter of marque. He brought 20 Africans on board his ship called the White Lion to the English colony near Hampton, Virginia, to trade them for supplies. Now Jope's transaction began an economic system of slavery that grew for 2 centuries, which shaped a society and a world economy. It was estimated that 12 million total slaves were sent to North America from Africa. And, and when they arrived, they were considered property and commodities, to their owner, who purchased them at auction houses in places like Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, New Orleans, Louisiana. And their prices were set based on age, physical ability, a breeding potential, and the buyers had no regard to the slave's family situation, as famously many were sold and split up, never to be seen again. By the 18th century, slavery was part of the culture and was the lifeblood of a growing economy in the colonies. And, the production of tobacco in Virginia, rice, indigo, eventually cotton created an economic boom in the immediate need for endless labor.
And it's because those crops are so labor intensive as
Yes,
well.
Yeah, especially when the cotton gin was invented in 1793. It grew that demand to an unprecedented level, which grew the need for more slave labor to keep up with the demand. So what does that do? This influx of slaves blew up the population, especially in the American South. By 1860, over 4 million slaves lived in the United States, making up an incredible 1/3 of the entire Southern population. But again, resistance from slaves again began right from the beginning, because nobody wants to be in that situation. And really that some of them had really dramatic occurrences. And you know what? This is the whole point of the episode, but just to talk about that resistance. July 2nd, 1839, a 25-year-old slave named Joseph Cinque, he led a revolt on a ship called the Amistad, which he led 53 slaves to take over the Spanish slave ship, killing its captain, Captain Ramon Ferrer, and demanded to be returned home to Africa. The United States Navy captured this ship and took them to New Haven, Connecticut. Must have been some traffic on that one. To face murder charges for Captain Ferrer. This case ultimately went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the slaves, who defended the slaves? John Quincy Adams, former president. He got them acquitted, surprisingly, and the slaves were returned in 1841 to their home at a place called Sierra Leone in West Africa. But resistance to slavery was everywhere, even if it wasn't as historic as the Amistad. And, regardless of risk, these rebellions, quiet or otherwise, they happened everywhere slavery existed. And there's more and more of these. And 1800, a blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser, he planned a rebellion at the Brookfield Plantation in Henrico County, Virginia, where he planned to gather fellow slaves and attack the Capitol building in Richmond, hoping to end slavery forever in Richmond. And, his plan got foiled. You know why? Because two of his conspirators told their masters about it, which led to 26 hangings, many others sold to other states. You know what happened to the two who ratted out their friends? They got freedom.
Wow.
They were awarded freedom. So it goes on and on. Of course, the most famous slave rebellion took place in 1831.
It's Nat Turner, right?
Nat Turner is a carpenter and a preacher. He led a group of slaves and he killed over 60 white people in Southampton County, Virginia, from August 21st to the 23rd, before he was captured and executed. You know what happened to Nat Turner?
He was executed.
He was executed. They peeled his skin off. They made him into souvenir handbags and sold them. Next time you go to Disney, be careful what you buy. His skull was said to have found its way to Worcester College in Ohio around 1866 for was lost to history. So they didn't take, the idea of slave rebellion was one that was very much feared and repulsed whenever they could.
And that's why they would try to escape. And in the early days, many would begin their journey without help and completed the self-emancipation without assistance. But as decades passed, with slavery remaining legal in the United States, there became more and more of an effort to assist these freedom seekers in their escape.
They did. And the thing, before we get to the details, is look at the big picture with this. Slaves found refuge in religion. And it always gave them that faith and a message of hope that someday their day of jubilee will come and free them all from their enslavers, and they'll be forever free. They also did their best to maintain that African culture as well, but the need for cotton and tobacco and sugar and everything else was enormous on the world stage, and its economic might. It maintained slavery despite fears of rebellion by plantation owners. And I think there was a thought that it would be temporary, it's going to go away eventually, but the economic realities chipped away at that notion, and slavery would somehow, it would not go on its own, despite the fact that this institution of slavery was never stable. It never totally was. And since any resistance, like before mentioned, was by slaves was going to directly cost their owners money,
Yep.
severe punishments were handed out, including whippings, brandings. And again, through it all, despite the physical punishment and the mental punishment and threats of selling their children, all that stuff, the concept of freedom always outweighed that fear of punishment. So any form of resistance, whether it be a hunger strike or breaking of tools, refusing to work, all the stuff you do at your job, it continued throughout the South. And what really, got to jump around timing here, but what really freaked a lot of people out was something happened in 1804. You know what happened in 1804? A group of slaves overthrew the government in Haiti and established an independent black republic that sent shockwaves throughout the country. This emboldened the slaves who felt their ultimate freedom was inevitable and that day of jubilee is going to somehow finally come. But again, the laws were not on the slaves' side.
No. In particular, we will talk about it, but the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Well, before that, the one of 1793 set the foundation. I mean, this was the law of the land, and it basically designed to remedy slave insurrections and basically trying to guarantee by law that any escaped slave would be returned, back to their owner. And so this is literally the law of the land is how this whole thing was going to go. And it does get worse, though, as we mentioned before. But this law authorized slaveholders or their agents, which is bounty hunters.
Look, to call it like it is, they're slave catchers.
Yeah, to cross state lines to retrieve them. And local officials were expected to aid in their capture. But here's the thing, though. There was no trial. There was no due process, for the captured slave, who would be sent back to slavery merely on the word of the agent or slaveholder. Freemen in the North were also hunted. and the law made no distinction between freeborn or escaped slave. So what does that do? It leads to things like kidnappings. They're flourishing in the North.
Yep.
Free men and women were dragged south into slavery without any legal right to challenge or protect them.
See, I would recommend here that our listeners, if they haven't yet watched the movie 12 Years a Slave.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what happened to him.
And any act to basically assist these people was a violation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 themselves. And that meant helping an escaped slave was now a federal crime. Now, okay, so what's the issue? Well, the issue for states like Vermont, who banned slavery in 1777, and the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Mary, also banned it in 1783. So with the passing of this first Fugitive Slave Act, these abolitionists in New England, it began to give them a louder voice to speak, and that issue of slavery became more and more a front-of-mind issue.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about the abolitionist movement in the United States because as time passes, with slavery remaining legal in the U.S., the Underground Railway and the abolitionist movement are going to become more intertwined together. As early as 1688, there were abolitionist movements. In particular, the 1688 Germantown Quaker petition against slavery is considered to have marked the beginning of the movement. During the era of the Revolutionary War, all states abolished the international slave trade, but South Carolina would reverse this decision. Between the Rev War and 1804, many northern states are going to do this gradual or immediate abolition of slavery. Not one southern state adopted these policies. And again, this is one of these things that is going to lead to the Civil War in 1861. In 1807, Congress makes the importation of slaves a crime, effective January 1st, 1808. The fundamentals behind being an abolitionist, like how the really hardcore ones felt about it, were that all men and women have the ability to do what is right and therefore are morally accountable for their actions. The intolerable evils of society are those that degrade the image of God in man, stunning or corrupting the individual's capacities for dignity, self-control, and self-respect. That the goal of all reform is to free individuals from being manipulated like physical objects, the redemption of man from the dominion of man. And this is slavery violates all of that for them. And a name often heard with abolitionist movement in the United States, and we're not going to talk very much about him, we've mentioned him in other episodes, is William Lloyd Garrison. He had a widely read anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator, which was the driving force behind the abolitionist era. It was founded in 1831 and it's going to be published in the great city of Boston until slavery in the United States was abolished by the 13th Amendment of 1865. Another thing about William Lloyd Garrison is he also supports rights for women. And while he initially opposes violence, as many abolitionists do at first, by the outbreak of the Civil War, Garrison recognizes that there had to be violence in order to bring about the end of slavery. And this is another thing, like John Brown, another guy we've talked about, he felt that way too. He realizes violence is going to be the only way to get rid of this institution.
I mean, going in the early 1800s, slavery. If you're in Boston, you're in upstate New York, Vermont, or wherever, it's a Southern thing. It doesn't affect your life. But with the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, it brought this issue into the North. William Lloyd Garrison, as much as Boston was a very abolitionist city, this is a guy who was physically beaten in the streets of Boston. Yeah. I mean, he probably had a Yankee hat on, but it's probably a different story. but you're seeing what this is doing now. It's now causing issues in the North. 1826 in Pennsylvania, this is the state with the largest black population in the North. They wrote its own law, despite the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, which gave legal protection to free blacks to protect them from kidnappers. In 1842, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that states were not obligated to enforce the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, but they could not obstruct it either, which absolutely makes no sense. But slaveholders again complained that they needed better laws to protect them and said, quote, abolitionists threatened their property rights. The South is going to get their chance in 1850 when California is going to be admitted into the Union as a free state. Southern politicians demanded that if they're going to support this, they needed a new law to protect slavery. Hence, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was written, which is basically the 1793 Act, but on steroids.
Yep.
On September 18, 1850, the Second Fugitive Slave Act was signed into law, which basically made every U.S. citizen part of the enforcement of slavery. Captured slaves could not testify on their behalf, and a commission was established by the federal government to decide the fate of the captured slave. If you're a magistrate and you're assigned by the federal government and you determined that a slave or a black person was a fugitive and should be returned to the South, if that was your decision, you got paid $10. If you had determined that the man in front of you was free and should stay free, you only got paid $5.
Wow.
So the incentive financially for the magistrate was to declare him a slave and send him back. The North became a Southern hunting ground, and no blacks, free nor fugitive, felt safe, even in cities like Boston or Philly or New York. In 1851, a black man named Thomas Sims, 19-year-old fugitive, he was a slave, was captured by a federal officer and marched through the streets of Boston under a guard before being turned back to the South. The next year, another man, Anthony Burns, was arrested, and this time the Bostonians, as we tend to do, protested, but ultimately Burns was returned to Virginia. If you saw any of President Obama's speech yesterday, he mentioned him. He mentioned Burns in his speech. But this 1850 Fugitive Slave Act made this resistance that we've been talking about even stronger. And white abolitionists and free blacks began to raise money now, for their legal defenses.
Yep.
In 1851, mobs in Syracuse, New York, raided a jail to free an escaped slave to save him. Some state Supreme Courts, like Wisconsin, of all states, they specifically declared the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. But again, before this act, and especially the first act, Northerners tolerated slavery as something that happened far away in the South, and it didn't affect them. But seeing federal agents patrolling northern streets, dragging blacks away in chains,
especially children,
right, was too much for many of these people to take. So what happens? This moral protest is going to grow into political resistance, which radicalized many in the North who realized that escaping slavery no longer meant running from a master. It was now running from the federal government and federal laws.
Yep. The other thing, too, that I want to say that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act does is it causes a lot of freed African Americans that live in the North. They will move to Canada.
That's the thing, because nowhere in the U.S. is safe. So Canada becomes the place to find freedom, especially the province of Ontario, which had been welcoming black men and women and children fleeing from bondage for years, going back to that first Fugitive Slave Act. Ontario, Canada, became the promised land to escaped slaves seeking freedom, as well as guys who wear denim. Within the shadow of the first act of 1800, going back to this, a new form of resistance grew, one that was quiet and moved on stealth. In 1831, an escaped slave named Tice Davids, he fled Kentucky for free Ohio. Think how bad it's got to be to go into Ohio for freedom. Think about it. As Davids approached the Ohio River, separating bondage from freedom, he noticed his master was in close pursuit, leaving him no choice but to jump into the river. David's master, he reached the shore and saw no sign of his escaping slave. So what does he do? The master returns home to his town of Ripley, Kentucky, and when someone asked him what happened to his slave, he said, quote, "He must have gone off on an underground road."
Yep.
According to historian William H. Siebert, this is how the phrase Underground Railroad got its name.
Yeah, and there's other instances of it too, where Dr. Robert Clemens Smedley wrote that when slave catchers could not find escaped slaves as far north as Columbia, Pennsylvania, they declared that there must be an underground railway some way. And the term was also used on August 10th, 1842, when an abolitionist newspaper in Albany, New York, published an article by a man named Thomas Smallwood. So there's different instances of when it's used, likely early to mid 1830s. Definitely by 1839 it's being used, and by 1830 or 1842 as well.
Yeah, so escaping slavery meant to do this Underground Railroad, it meant organization, but it needed to be quiet and covert. So what many in the North didn't realize was that the secret pathway to freedom already existed for decades, well before 1850, because simply escaping into the North didn't guarantee freedom anymore. The focus was finding a path into Canada. There are several stories how the Underground Railroad truly began, but one of the most popular theories comes from a group called the Freemasons, Mary, as well as religious leaders who lived in the North who despised slavery and worked to help those escape it. One of the most famous individuals attributed to the Underground Railroad was a Freemason and abolitionist named Levi Coffin. Coffin was born on October 28, 1798, in Guilford County, North Carolina. He's also a Quaker. He despised the institution of slavery as he witnessed several of its atrocities when he was a kid in North Carolina. He moved to Indiana in 1826, where he became a farmer, and he eventually became an investor in a local bank, made a lot of money. Soon he began taking in escaping slaves who crossed the Ohio River and into Cincinnati. He built a farm in the town of Fountain City, Indiana, which is about 75 miles north of Cincinnati in 1839, and he used his farm as a place for escaping slaves to temporarily stay where they'd be fed, they'd be clothed, and that eventually led to a different place further north. Since the phrase Underground Railroad gives the impression of moving and transportation, railroad phrases began to be used for people who played a part in the escape of slaves. Homeowners who housed them became known as station managers, while those who took escaping slaves from one place to the next were called conductors. Slaves themselves were called passengers. By using abolitionist Freemasons in the area, Coffin set up a series of homes that escaping slaves could stay at during their move north. He took slaves in at any time of the night. He never turned them away. But since he knew that slave catchers were known to pretend to be conductors on the Underground Railroad to catch slaves, what does Coffin do? He uses only Freemasons as conductors, who would be forced to basically provide Masonic codes to prove they were Masons before releasing their slaves into care. Coffin and his wife Catherine did this for 20 years, and his home was so busy it was referred to as Grand Central Station. And Coffin himself was called the president of the Underground Railroad. It is said that the Coffins helped over 3,000 escaped slaves find freedom through their Underground Railroad network from Ohio through Indiana, eventually into Canada.
And Coffin would also be known as a stockholder, because that's what the financial benefactors of the Underground Railway were known as. The River Jordan was a code word used for the Ohio River. Heaven and Promised Land were the code words used for Canada. And the Big Dipper was known as the Drinking Gourd.
There was a lot of different things we'll talk about. But again, these station managers were putting themselves and their families in extreme danger by hiding slaves. If you got caught, you were facing a year in jail in today's equivalent of a $40,000 fine, which would bankrupt families, With slave owners providing rewards for the recapture of their slaves, a temptation to let slave catchers know the location of these stations and exposing their protectors, which was always a constant fear. Conductors probably ran the most risk because they were out in open and exposed during the movements. But again, they did their best to hide their passengers in wagons, under hay. But often they were on foot as they walked through the woods at night. And just like you hinted at a second ago, to help guide them to their next station, many secret codes, songs, and symbols were reportedly established to those in the know who would understand, and slave catchers would not. They would ignore them. On safe houses, they used quilts, which was used to let a conductor know if it was safe. A quilt with the symbol of a bow tie told him to disguise himself. A bear paw meant to follow the animal path to find hidden water or food and to avoid any humans. A log cabin symbol meant the house was safe and he could bring his passengers there safely and without fear. A winding line, or what was called a drunkard's path, meant to take an unpredictable route to avoid capture, or it told people that where Mary's house was, one or the other. A monkey's wrench told them to prepare for escape. Now, here's the thing, though. Many historians question the authenticity of these symbols as folklore, but since they were carried through oral tradition and don't appear written anywhere, it makes sense because it plays into that secrecy of what they were doing, because why would they write it down? So it's likely possible that this is what they did. We saw some of these. There's a museum in Chambersburg where they had copies of these, so it certainly was available.
And I don't think a lot was written down. Like, that's what I was reading about. Communication, as you said, is done by word of mouth, but there's also numeric code and encrypted messages. William Still, who I'm going to talk about near the end of this episode, there's one message I found from him, and he wrote, "I have sent via at 2:00 4 large hams and 2 small hams. This means that 4 adults and 2 children had been sent from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. The via indicates passengers, and they're not on a train. They're on foot." And basically, when he meant at some point he does mention train, it says they're going by way of Reading, PA, to get to the next place that they need to get on the Underground Railway. But that's one way that they would just encrypt everything. There's no, headquarters or governing body, nor there's not published guides, maps, or pamphlets, or even newspaper articles about it. This is all being done in secret and with symbols and coded language.
It was that, and you mentioned that the gourd. I mean, that's the Big Dipper and
the Northern Star
and the North Star. If it was cloudy, escaped slaves were told to study trees and look for moss, because moss usually grows on the north side of the tree. So use them as guides if necessary. But like I said a little while ago, religion played a huge part in the Underground Railroad, not just as a promise of hope, but to prepare slaves to escape, and it offered an instructional infrastructure as well. In Quaker houses in Ohio and Pennsylvania, white allies bound by their dislike for slavery used their meeting houses as station houses. While the escaped slaves were in their houses, they were taught signal songs, which if they paid attention closely to the words, it taught them how to escape to the north. These songs were ciphered, including coded lyrics discussing crossing rivers, using that Big Dipper and North Star as guides to help them on their journey. The words were coded so any slave catcher who heard a slave singing it would not realize these songs were actually codes for directions. You mentioned the Follow the Drinking Gourd. That was one of the more popular slave songs, called Follow the Drinking Gourd, which the code was the code for the Big Dipper. And the lyrics go, quote, "When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. Follow the old man is waiting to carry you to freedom. For if you follow the drinking gourd." So in Kentucky churches, slaves whispered codes to each other so the pro-slave whites couldn't overhear them. But again, to them, these codes and secrets are part of God's plan for their day of Jubilee. And religion became the sword and the shield, because it offered guidance to move, but also protected them at the same time. The abolitionist movement got a shot in the arm in 1852 when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which attacked the overall morality of slavery and caused an awakening in the North and the South about slavery, which increased that tension that was growing between the both parts of the country. Stowe and her husband, his name was Calvin. He was a professor at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. He rented a home on 63 Federal Street in Brunswick, Maine. Here, she wrote a book while sheltering an escaped slave named John Andrew Jackson. One of Calvin Stowe's students was particularly interested in Harriet's book, so she often read him excerpts, while she was writing it. You know who the student was? Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. But Uncle Tom's Cabins, the inspiration really came from it's a lot of them, but it came really from a Kentucky slave named Josiah Hinson, who carried his 2 small children on his back in a cotton sack, on his shoulder. He walked 500 miles, just like the Proclaimers song, right? From Frankfort, Kentucky, through Cincinnati to Sandusky, Ohio, home of Tommy Boy, and then across Lake Erie to Toronto. His story became Stowe's inspiration for her book, which also included other real stories of slaves as well, including the story of Eliza Harris. Harris was a slave from Kentucky who saw 2 of her small children die and was left with just her 2-year-old son Henry, a toddler, who was about to be sold into slavery. With the prospect of losing her entire family, Eliza took her toddler and escaped, hoping to cross that frozen Ohio River and escape into Cincinnati. This is the winter of 1838. She made her escape and was chased by a slave catcher, on horseback carrying a pair of rifles. But she expected the river to be frozen. But when she got there, she was mortified to find out it was slushy, with just floating chunks of ice, which made her passage carrying a baby extremely difficult and dangerous. But she knew she couldn't return, so she had to brave the river carrying that child in her arms. She literally jumped from one ice chunk to the other, at times finding herself in waist-deep freezing water while trying to keep Henry's head above the cold water. Across the river on the Ohio side was a man named William Lacey, who was a friend of Levi Coffin, that president of the Underground Railroad, who helped them get to shore and guided them to Coffin's farm in Indiana, where she rested for a while and then made her way into Canada. But Harriet Beecher Stowe used this story in Uncle Tom's Cabin and was so blown away by Eliza's bravery, she used her actual name instead of a character name. So that's how important she was.
There was also a man called Alexander Milton Ross, who I found his story when looking into Canada and the Underground Railway. He's from Belleville, Ontario, and he has bird watching as a hobby. And what he does is he travels to the south to go, quote unquote, bird watching. But while he's there, he will speak to slaves about the Underground Railway and the network. And he would even begin to provide them with a few simple supplies to begin their escape. So this is someone going into the South and starting to help these people out and letting them know that there is hope.
Absolutely. And there's so many stories of it, but the Underground Railroad wasn't just focused on land, it was also on the sea as well. Captain Daniel Drayton, he was a ship captain who sailed a ship called the Pearl, up and down
not the Black Pearl?
Black Pearl. It went up and down the East Coast. Drayton was not an abolitionist, and he had zero sympathy for the plight of the blacks, because you know why? He didn't consider them to be human. He thought they were some sort of sub-creature and did not deserve human rights. But one day, he met some free blacks on his ship, and after a long conversation with them, he discovered he was wrong, and not only were they human, but smart and with the same fears and goals that he did. So Drayton became sympathetic to their cause. And while in the South, he met a black mother of 5 who was trying to escape north to join her husband, who had already escaped, to reunite with the family. So Drayton decided to stow them away and sail them north. From that point on, Drayton decided that he would be a conductor on the Underground Railroad on his boat and free as many escaped slaves north as he could. In 1848, he attempted the largest transport of escaped slaves at one time in history, when he stowed 76 slaves on his ship to take them up to New Bedford, Massachusetts, so they could enjoy, freedom. But unfortunately for Drayton, he got caught, and he was captured near the mouth of the Potomac River, and all those slaves, after being discovered, were sent back into the South for slavery. Drayton himself, he was in prison for 4 years, but eventually he got pardoned by President Millard Fillmore. So Drayton's free, but he struggled to live with the guilt of what happened to those 76 slaves. So on July 1st, 1857, he checks into the Mansion House Hotel in New Bedford, Mass., and he shoots himself, kills himself.
Gosh.
He's buried in Rural Cemetery in New Bedford, Mass., and to this date, parishioners from a black church nearby take care of his grave as a tribute to Captain Drayton for what he did for his escaped slaves.
Yeah.
But all of these conductors, as and station managers, really, they took their lives into their own hands. But the most famous conductor in the history of the Underground Railroad is without a doubt Araminta Ross. Mm-hmm. Ross was born in March of 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, to enslaved parents. Ross spent her childhood beaten by her masters, which likely caused brain damage, and it caused her, in her mind, to have visions that she saw as attributed to God, which made her very devoutly religious. In 1848, Ross escaped to Philadelphia and became free, and she changed her name to what the world knows her as today, Harriet Tubman. Now, despite her freedom, Tubman returned to the South 19 times to conduct 300 slaves to escape freedom, to freedom over a 10-year period, and earned the nickname Moses, a name that was a hero in the North and was a feared and hated in the South. She's like 5 feet tall, nothing pounds.
Yeah.
But she ran a tight ship, and she was secreting escaped slaves north, and at times had to lead them with a pistol. Her quote was, quote, "Life is ahead and death is behind you." She said at times, reminding them that everyone needs to keep going no matter what, and no one's going to be left behind. Because leaving someone behind meant certain capture, but it also threatened the safety of the entire group. So leaving a straggler was never an option, even if they couldn't go on.
Yep. And if you visit Niagara Falls, Ontario today, you can see where she brought them across, because by 1848, the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge had been built. It's no longer there. There's another bridge. But it had crossed the Niagara River and connects New York to Canada. And this bridge is used as part of the Underground Railway, and it's kind of like one of the terminuses of it. And this is where Harriet Tubman would lead people to freedom.
And the bridge is still there today. You visit it today. The abolitionist Thomas Garrett said of Tubman in 1868, quote, "I never met a person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God as spoken direct to her soul." And again, when you look at the big picture, when the Civil War ends and the 13th Amendment is passed and the House of Representatives, finally passes it in January 31st of 1865, it instantly freed 4 million enslaved people in the United States. Their path was given to them by a vote and a signature, but their path was ultimately led at that moment by the 500,000 who escaped bondage on the Underground Railroad. And though they didn't have to find freedom like a fugitive named Henry Brown, whose conductor Samuel Smith literally mailed him in a wooden crate from Richmond to Philadelphia, or deal with the mysterious conductor in Petersburg, Virginia, who was only known to his passengers and station managers as, quote, ham and eggs.
Green ham.
Their freedom tasted just as sweet thanks to those who risked everything on their road to freedom under that secret darkness of what was the Underground Railroad.
Yeah. And the journey is a dangerous one for those that are making it because it's done mainly on foot. Sometimes you could go in a wagon or a carriage or horses, had to travel over water, as the story you told with the woman having to jump from one ice floe to the other. And travel was most of the time done at night because you could not be discovered. And you also needed the stars to guide your way.
You need the stones you needed to have to do this, especially when you think about it. You're not just being chased by a master, you're being chased by the law. The law of the land was against you in this, which required for anyone to help you, they needed to break the law.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that, they probably would have had more help. But when you're looking at big jail times and you're looking at big fines, being ostracized, by your neighbors, and you're losing your job because of what you're doing, it's a fascinating history. And in a lot of these towns, McAllister's Mill right here in Gettysburg was a very popular one by the McAllister family.
Well, we went on that tour led by Dean Schultz about a month and a half ago, and part of it, you are walking on the path of the Underground Railway. And he told us a story where that there were people that they remembered hearing, they could hear the bloodhounds chasing the escaped slaves.
No, it's like anything else. I mean, the Underground Railroad was a culmination of centuries of resistance. But again, it's such a dark part of history. But at the end of the day, regardless of any fears of death or imprisonment, people are going to do whatever they can to be free. Mm-hmm. And on a day like Juneteenth, we're recording this today, it just reminds you of the plight of the people who came before us and everybody else to achieve their own freedom just to be equal. So it's an important day in history. It's an important study to learn. And for the people we talked about, guys like Coffin, Harriet Tubman, Drayton, all these people, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Grab yourself a book and read some of their stories, because for every story we tell, there's 100 that we didn't tell, that every one of these people risked their life and their livelihood and their own individual freedom to help people that they never knew or never will know after they left, just because they were looking at the greater good. Yeah. So that's why it's important. That's why it's an important thing to study when you go and read these things, and you go to these places and you hear their stories. Because it's not that long ago. It really isn't. And it resonates even today. And you can still walk in the footsteps, like you mentioned, on that slave road here in Gettysburg. Yeah. To walk in the steps of these brave men, women, and children who left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, just for a hope of freedom. No guarantee of freedom, but just the hope and to escape what they were used to. And it's such a powerful story. It really, really is.
Yeah. And so we mentioned before that the terminus of the Underground Railway is in Canada. Now, that's not the only place people are going. People are going to what was termed Indian Territory at the time. They're going west. Some are going to Mexico for a time. They went to Spanish Florida. But Canada has it is a strong connection to the Underground Railway. And 30 to 40,000 escaped slaves were brought to Canada via the Underground Railway, including by Harriet Tubman. So in 1793, the Act to Limit Slavery was passed in Upper Canada. And this means that any enslaved person who reaches Upper Canada became free upon arrival. And this also ended slavery in Canada. And there was a few who reached Canada with any help because it's before the Underground Railway was established. Following the War of 1812, word began to really spread that freedom could be found in Canada. And this is why Canada is seen as the promised land and a place that you can live free. And arrivals of escaped slaves and also freedmen increased after 1850 in Canada because of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, because things became even worse. But before that, obviously, they are escaping to Canada too. And it's because this act empowers slave catchers to pursue fugitive states into northern states. Many of the former slaves would migrate to various areas of Ontario, mainly southwestern Ontario. So Niagara Falls, Buxton, Chatham, Owen Sound, Windsor, Hamilton, Brantford, London, London, Oakville, and Toronto. And they also fled to other areas of Canada as well, which was that time called British North America. And this includes New Brunswick, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. These former slaves are going to help build strong communities and contribute to the development of places in which they lived and worked. And I have a couple of examples of those to talk about in a few minutes. There are actually some instances of slave catchers crossing into Canada to find escaped slaves and return them to their southern owners. There was a case where a slave owner and a slave catcher were in search of a young man named Joseph Alexander. After Alexander's community in Ontario found out about the owner and the catcher, a large crowd of black members of the community, including Alexander, gathered outside the Royal Exchange Hotel. Alexander was among them, and he actually exchanges a few words with his former owner. He rejected their offer of $100 to accompany them to Windsor. I don't know what they were trying to tell him, like, oh no, we're just going to take you to Windsor. The crowd refused to let the men seize Alexander, and they were forced to leave town. Alexander continued to live in freedom in Canada. There are also communities founded in Canada by former enslaved peoples. This includes the Don Settlement, Buxton, which was settled in 1849 by abolitionist Reverend William King. It's one of the final stops on the Underground Railway in southern Ontario, and it's one of the most successful refugee communities, and it's also known as the Elgin Settlement.
St. Catharines, too.
Yep. St. Catharines, Hamilton. There's one called Africville, which is north of the city of Halifax in Nova Scotia. The first records of settlement date to 1761, and it becomes recognized as a destination for escaped slaves in 1848. It is a mix of refugees later on as refugees from the War of 1812, escaped slaves from the U.S., and including Jamaica Maroons, which are individuals who escaped slavery in Jamaica and were deported to Nova Scotia. It's a thriving community for 120 years despite discrimination from the larger Halifax community. Residents of Africville would pay taxes but did not receive basic amenities like clean water and garbage disposal. In 1964, the city of Halifax voted to demolish Africville. In 2010, the mayor apologized for what happened. There's also a community in Birchtown, Nova Scotia, and Sandwich First Baptist Church in Ontario has connections to escaped slaves from the Underground Railway. And just a couple of people that I found. The Harriet Tubman we talked about. William Still is another one that has a very prominent role in the Underground Railway. He's considered one of the fathers of it. He's born in 1821 in New Jersey. He settles in Philadelphia. He's an African-American abolitionist. And when he settles in Philadelphia, he begins working as a clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. He will help hundreds of slaves escape and sometimes hide them in his Philadelphia home. He keeps records, including short biographies of people, that contain frequent metaphors for the railway. He would publish these accounts in the book, The Underground Railroad, Authentic Narratives and First-Hand Accounts in 1872. He's going to be a supporter of Tubman when she began to work for the Underground Railway. And in 1859, Sill will shelter several of John Brown's associates fleeing the raid on Harper's Ferry. He participated in the he participated in a story that had national coverage, and this is the rescue of a slave named Jane Johnson. She sought the help of society when passing through Philadelphia with her master, John Hill Wheeler. Sill and others liberated her and her two sons because, as you mentioned, Darren, under Pennsylvania law, it held that slaves that were brought to the free state of Pennsylvania voluntarily by a slaveholder could choose their freedom. Her master ends up suing Sill and 5 other African Americans for assault and kidnapping in this very high-profile case in August of 1855. Jane ended up returning to Philadelphia from New York to testify in court as to her independence in choosing freedom. She won an acquittal for Sill and 4 others and reduced the sentences for 2 of the men as well. Thomas Downing was a free black man who lived in New York. He operated an oyster restaurant as a stop on the Underground Railway. Freedom seekers would hide in the basement of his restaurant. There's another one I wanted to talk about, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She actually is an American-Canadian, African-American Canadian, and her parents were both free African-Americans who were active in abolitionist circles as well as the Underground Railway. She is born in Delaware in 1823, but her family ends up moving to Pennsylvania so that she can be educated because Delaware did not allow black children to be educated. And in Westchester, Pennsylvania, she will attend a Quaker school and she will teach. And she will later teach in Delaware, where it wasn't really legal for her to do so, but she does it anyway, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And her approach was that education is central to achieving racial equality. When the Fugitive Slave Act passes in 1850, she goes to Canada and settles in Windsor, Ontario, and later Chatham. In both areas, she establishes schools, and she will teach the children of former slaves who had escaped on the Underground Railway, and she will also teach their parents as well at night. Because in a lot of cases, these escapees, they don't know how to read because it was illegal for slaves to read in many places in the South. So many of them did not know how to read. So she's going to teach them that so they can begin that education. In 1853, she founded the anti-slavery newspaper, the Provincial Freeman, and the paper was devoted to anti-slavery, temperance, and general literature. And it unfortunately just ran for 4 years before they ran out of money. She also believed that black children should be taught alongside white children, which put her at odds with some members of the black community in her Ontario town that she lived in, because there were those that still believed in segregation. When her husband dies in 1860, she moves back to the United States, but she's really struggling financially. Her friend and fellow abolitionist Martin Robinson Delaney offered her a job recruiting officers for black men in the Union Army. And she would be the first black woman to actively recruit Union troops. And she will remain in D.C. after the Civil War. She's going to be Howard University's first female law student and one of the first black women to earn a law degree in the United States. And she will also go on to teach at Howard University as well. Mm-hmm. In 1874, she and a group of women addressed the House Judiciary Committee regarding the women's right to vote. And she also supported the suffragist movement in Canada, where she attended a rally in 1881. She will pass away from stomach cancer in 1893. Her brother Isaac Shadd hosted gatherings to plan the raid at Harper's Ferry in his home. Her family, she has many prominent members in her family. She's a very interesting individual. Joshua Glover was an escaped slave in St. Louis, Missouri. And he ends up being captured and jailed in Wisconsin because of the Fugitive Slave Act. Abolitionists eventually stormed the jail, set him free, and he went on his journey on the Underground Railway. He was eventually put on board a ship and headed to Canada. He gets married, gets a job, and he lives as a free man in Canada for the rest of his life. So those are just a few of the individuals I found.
Well, like we were saying, there's stories upon stories just waiting to be discovered on the Underground Railroad. So it's something that's definitely worthwhile. But I think we can drop it here. I think it's, like I said a few minutes ago, it's a great story to study. It's a sad story. It's out of necessity, but I think it's one that, especially in a day like today, is an important one to remember.
Well, it's important even not just on Juneteenth, but it's an important part of the history of the Civil War as well, because the Underground Railway is still happening during the Civil War.
Right, and so that's definitely something to study. It certainly is. So any final words from you? Actually, wait, before I say that, though, what's coming up for us next?
Oh, our next episode is going to be about the Battle of Bruinsburg, the biggest amphibious landing in the United States, next until D-Day.
You mean they were men and fish landing? They were amphibians? You probably thought it was. But,
Can't talk.
But hey, kudos to you, Mary, because you found out that the Underground Railroad was not underground, nor was it a railroad. So, because
I used to think it was underground.
I know you did.
We started learning about it when I was in primary school.
Like mole people or something.
I actually thought it was underground.
I know you did. We've had that conversation before. We have. Anyway, so what's coming up for it? So Bruinsburg is coming up. That's going to be a fantastic story.
Yep.
That's part of the Vicksburg campaign, which is coming up. This is the largest amphibious landing up until D-Day, which we just passed as well in history. So we have that coming up. So a lot of cool stuff coming down the road. We're going to talk about the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, will be coming up here pretty soon. And so we got some other stuff coming. So all right. So now I will say, any final words from you?
No, thank you for bringing it like you always do. Thank you to our listeners for supporting us for these last 171 episodes as well.
Absolutely, Mary. You know what I learned this weekend? No Scotland, no party.
No.
Absolutely.
Jesus,
Off we
Scots.
go. Everybody have a great rest of the weekend. Have a fantastic, safe, long weekend holiday. The weather is warm. A lot of fun stuff to do. Go hit the battlefields. Go to the museums. Get out there and learn some stuff. All right.
See y'all next time.
Peace out.
Bye.
Bye.